Hello and welcome to Profile of the Pangolin. This web slideshow-esque movie is my final project for the fall 2012 semester of Michigan State University's Global Risks, Conservation, and Criminology class instructed by Dr. Meredith Gore. I'm Paul Gledhill. The pangolin is a scaly anteater, a mammal. There are 8 species of pangolin that exist in tropical areas of Africa and Asia. Now 2 of these species, ones found in Asia, are endangered. 4 of them are listed under Appendix 2 of the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife, Fauna, and Flora, that's CITES for short. In addition to habitat degradation pressures that exist for all pangolins, these animals are under extreme poaching pressure. A huge source of demand driving this pressure comes from Chinese citizens and their demand for traditional medicinal and culinary consumption of pangolins. This movie examines this conservation issue. I especially take a closer look into the pangolin demand in China, and this involves delving into Chinese culture. What will it take to solve this conservation crisis? The pangolin is a mammal of its own order, Phyllidota. It's often described as a scaly anteater, however, it's technically not an anteater. The pangolin primarily eats termites and ants, using a long specialized tongue. The pangolin is entirely different from all mammals, as it is covered in scales. And these scales are created of thick keratin, and that's the protein that makes up our fingernails and dogs' and cats' claws. Now these scales are used as a very effective form of protection, as we see here. As a mammal, versus say a reptile, the pangolin are relatively slow to get to reproductive age and take a great deal of time in gestation. Important factors concern for conservation of any mammal because disruptions to their populations take a harder toll. Oh, and there's a Pokemon character based on the pangolin. Here you can see the range of the 8 species of pangolin. The Chinese and the Suda pangolins are endangered. All other species are considered near threatened except for the ground pangolin, which is listed as least concerned. These listings are based on the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List. Habitat loss and consumption as bushmeat are large stresses that exist for all pangolins. However, in recent years, it has been observed that pangolins, and especially Asian pangolin populations, have been crashing. In the year 2000, CITES added 3 of the Asian pangolin species to their Appendix 2 list, stating that these species may not be removed from the wild or traded for any commercial use. In subsequent years, a 4th, the Philippine pangolin, was added to the list. In the CITES proposal explanation for the 2000 listings, it explains that data is very limited on penguins since they are largely solitary, nocturnal, and specialist feeders. Despite that, clear evidence was cited that loss of habitat is impacting the animals. The 2000 CITES document goes on to outline that there is a huge demand for all 3 pangolins throughout Asia for meat and as medicine. Of particular note in that document is China's demand for the pangolin, the whole animal, and just its scales. More on that later. A 2005 Time magazine story follows a middle-aged man into the woods of South Sumatra. The man lights a small fire just below a hole in a tree in the middle of the day. I never knew before that snakes and turtles were valuable, let alone the pangolin, the man says as he is trying to smoke out a pangolin. The scales of the pangolin protects the animal from lions biting them, but they are slow animals and asleep during the day, easy pickings for humans that know where to look. Traffic sponsored a 2008 workshop on trade and conservation of pangolins in Asia. The workshop's proceedings goes through country after country, explaining that this type of poaching is not unique. I should note here that Traffic is a widely respected, huge nonprofit organization with the mission of ending all wildlife trade that causes conservation problems. I think a Burks et al. 2006 paper in Science explains very well how globalization is allowing poachers to be able to fill wildlife demands that geography used to control. With the marginal cost of transporting goods going down and the ease of access to changing information via the web, it makes sense that globalization is causing street prices of Indonesian or even African pangolins to be rising, even though they are being exported huge distances, mostly to China. I'll use some information from pangolin poaching trade busts to try to explain the vast number of pangolins being trafficked. The biggest bust I came across was in late 2011 over 5 metric tons of pangolin meat was seized from a boat on the coast of Malaysia. Around the same time in Vietnam, nearly a half metric ton of pangolin, which included 106 live animals, were found literally stuffed into a compact car. It also contained a dozen of counterfeit car license plates, sure signs of smuggling. This car was pretty much stopped at random, so we can assume it's just a small sampling of the total number of pangolins being transported. I also want to note that the car in this slide is not the one that was found in Vietnam, rather a different pangolin smuggling bust. An Interpol operation that became public knowledge just this year cites that they have confiscated 1,220 pangolin in all sorts of various stages of poaching. That's trapping to consuming. There are literally tons of pangolins being poached and moved to China. The pangolin trade seems to follow the same routes as does much wildlife trading. This diagram from Singyong Chin, who works for Traffic in Malaysia, was presented at the Traffic's Pangolin Workshop. It shows the collectors to the end users of pangolins as bubbles in the middle. It shows the price pangolins fetch on the left side. Pangolins inflate from $24 US to $227 per kilogram from those actors. The right side of this diagram explains the behaviors of those actors. Here Chin has identified that most Malaysian poached pangolins trade through Thailand and then smuggled into China via one of its neighboring countries or directly by sea or air. So we've established what pangolins are, that they are in demand, and that this demand is really threatening their species. A majority, and from all of the sources I've seen, I feel comfortable in saying a vast majority of pangolins that are poached are heading to China. Why does China want to use the pangolin so much? The earliest known records of what we today call traditional Chinese medicines, TCMs, date back 2,200 years. What today is called, in English, the Herbal Encyclopedia of TCMs has 461 animals or parts of animals listed as having curative powers, and pangolin scales are something of a superdrug in this source. They are said to cure at least 6 generally unrelated ailments. I did not find all of these ailments from one source. In fact, it is striking the variability of medical applications that the pangolin is supposed to have. This isn't a Chinese-only phenomena. I've run across citations from Indian pangolin being used for various medicinal reasons in that country. I've analyzed a paper that deals with the Nigerian medicinal consumption uses of pangolin, and it seems a very wide variety of ailments are treated with pangolin there too. However, there is another, much more damaging and seemingly more widely spread applied use of pangolins in China. Consumption as a delicacy. Along the way of using pangolins for medicine, the Chinese have decided that it is a sought-after meat. I have sources that seem to link the healthfulness of the pangolin from using its scales in medicine to the healthfulness in eating it. As far as how delicacies come about, the pangolin sort of makes sense. It's an animal that is rarely seen, as it is nocturnal, but has, up until recent years, been relatively easy to obtain if you're willing to pay the high price. The Guardian newspaper did a piece on pangolins where it interviewed a Chinese pangolin chef. I'm going to read now a quote from that chef. Quote, "We keep them alive in cages until the customer makes an order. Then, we hammer them unconscious, cut their throats, and drain their blood. It is a slow death. We then boil them and remove the scales. We cut the meat into small pieces and use it to make a number of dishes, including braised meat and soup. Usually, the customer takes the blood home with them afterwards." Xu Ling, who works for Traffic, presented at the Pangolin Workshop results from a survey of a handful of large Chinese cities that pangolin meat is available in 18% of restaurants. Now, there are 2 rigorous studies that are pivotal in looking at this issue. One is a paper in the Journal of Biodiversity Conservation by Zhang from 2008, and a research project funded by Traffic from 2012. These studies used extensive surveys about banned wildlife consumption in several Chinese cities. They found between 31 and 44% of urban adults admitted to consuming wildlife products that are controlled. Both of these studies found that men with higher levels of education and income were the largest source of wildlife consumers. Social status and consuming something that is rare were large motivators for consumers. Peer pressure is a factor here. There's quite a bit of research backing up this assertion. I've examined papers from Biotropica, Human Ecology Review, and Environmental Conservation that all look into very different issues of Chinese wildlife consumption. Every one of these papers comes to the fact that China's growing consumer class is demanding banned wildlife for consumption, and as China's consumer economy continues to grow, this recent problem will continue to get worse. So now, in addition to knowing about the pangolin and its dire strait, you know what's putting such a demand on these animals. But just what is being done about this? And what needs to be done? Some good questions. First, we'll look at what China does within its own borders. The Chinese government still endorses the use of pangolin scale if obtained via legal means for medicinal reasons. Zhang Yu, a Chinese government official, presented at the 2008 traffic workshop. Yu acknowledged that there are areas China can work harder on, but outlined that very strict rules were enacted in 2007 in order to deter smuggling of pangolins into China. Yu explained that especially serious offenders can face life imprisonment or worse. Yu's presentation gave an example of a case in which the top 2 players in a smuggling ring were put to death. The Chinese official focused intently on the nation's efforts to stop pangolins from illegally entering the country or being poached from its extremely depleted domestic population. Yu's paper accompanying that official's presentation contains a fair amount of doublespeak about pangolins being used for consumption in China. A statement regarding the, quote, psychological receptivity of the medicinal uses reads to me that the government, or at least this official, is admitting a traditionally rooted placebo effect. Additionally, from the presentation's paper, Yu states that the use of pangolin meat for food as, quote, tonic requires, quote, extensive educational campaigns as supplementary measures to the prohibitive administration provisions to encourage the public to foster a civilized dietetic concept, end quote. That's a mouthful, and it seems to me to be a general dodge by the government to addressing consumer demand. And that's not really surprising considering 18% of restaurants are reported to having pangolin meat available. Internationally, there's the CITES ban of any export or import of the 4 Asian pangolin species for commercial use. This was mentioned earlier in the movie. CITES is a convention that resulted in a multilateral treaty for trade in endangered species of wild fauna and flora. Asian pangolins are listed on the CITES Appendix 2. There's been many proposals for upgrading pangolins to the Appendix 1 schedule. And this would offer the pangolin a higher priority of protection, although I admittedly haven't found much evidence that this would immediately help the pangolin. In email exchanges with Carrie Parker of the Pangolin Conservation Support Initiative, she told me that in the upcoming CITES meetings, her group is pushing to have all 8 species of pangolins upped to the Appendix 1 schedule based on the evidence of increasing demand. She is not optimistic that there is enough evidence for this to happen, however. Earlier in this movie, I described several smuggling busts from enforcement efforts. This year, Interpol announced that its Operation Libra has been focusing on pangolin trade. I've already mentioned that they claim to have confiscated 1,220 pangolins. Also, in February of this year, the International Union for Conservation of Nature created a specialist group to deal specifically with the pangolin. With these increased efforts and large number of pangolins being seized, deterring would-be smugglers, it seems that international trade enforcement agencies are on the ball at addressing pangolin trade. But is that enough? Can slowing the supply alone overcome the demand in China? The 2 studies noted above gauged the Chinese culture of consuming pangolins suggests it will not. These studies found that while a fair amount of Chinese citizens knew that pangolins were banned, about 60% of them, these survey respondents did not indicate that knowing this alone stops them from consuming the mammal. It should be noted that the 2003 SARS and the 2004 bird flu epidemics did deter some from consuming wildlife. Banned wildlife non-consumers and consumers in China all agreed that smuggling and trading enforcement is weak. Most even said that they would support more wildlife protection. So why are they still consuming? It seems the cultural significance to consuming